Hi everyone. So this is my Unit 15 summary. So let me bring up the images and figures I'm going to talk through. So Unit 15 is largely about one thing, which is inflation. So what we're going to do is see how we can use the labor market model and the multiplier model that we've seen previously to understand how inflation might come about, and in particular, how a sort of wage price spiral where inflation just keeps on rising, how that comes about. And then towards the end of the video, we'll look at how governments could potentially use monetary and fiscal policy to deal with those kind of incidents. So just to begin with a little bit of terminology. So what do we mean by inflation? We just mean that the price level, the general price level, is increasing. And then deflation just means the opposite, that the general price level is falling. Now, a third term that it's important to be kind of familiar with is disinflation. And that just means that although inflation is carrying on, like there is inflation, the price level is rising, it means that it is not rising as fast as it was previously. So like a simple kind of numerical example, let's say that last year, the inflation rate was 4%. So the price level went up by 4% compared to the previous year. And now this year, the inflation rate is 2%. So 2% increase in price level compared to last year. So we still have inflation, but the rate of inflation is getting smaller. And that's what we mean by disinflation. So something that we can really only see over time, over a couple of years. So why is inflation something that we care about? Well, there can be winners and losers from inflation, and two simple examples of winners and losers. So if we have borrowers who have what's called nominal debt, okay, what we mean by that is their debt that they owe isn't linked to the rate of inflation. It's just sort of a fixed amount at a particular year. If people are borrowing and they have nominal debt, then they're actually going to benefit from inflation, because over time, as the price level rises, the kind of real amount that they owe is actually getting less and less and less, right? So you can become smaller in real terms. Now, the people who lose will potentially be the people who are lending to them. So lenders who are lending nominal assets, they kind of experience the opposite, right? That you know, the amount of like money that they are getting back is becoming worth less and less and less every single year as prices are rising, and they're getting this fixed kind of nominal amount back. Then that fixed nominal amount every year is actually worth and can buy them less and less and less goods, fewer and fewer goods, I should say. So really simple example of some winners and losers there, and a useful concept to help us understand who might win and lose when it comes to borrowing and lending and inflation is the idea of the real interest rate. So to kind of calculate the real interest rate, also known as the Fisher equation, what we do is take the nominal interest rate and then just subtract the inflation rate. So I mean, right now we have kind of a good example of how using this would actually show us something quite interesting about the real interest rate in the economy. So in 2022, right now, the nominal interest rate in lots of countries around the world is around 0.5%, maybe a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but the inflation rate is sort of like 5% or 6%. So we can see right now the real interest rate in most countries around the world is actually quite negative, that there is a real disincentive to save. There's a big encouragement for people to go out and spend. So that equation can be quite helpful in kind of getting a sense of who might be winning and losing when it comes to borrowing and lending. Now, some other issues with inflation. Well, one is if inflation, deflation, if the price change is very volatile, right? If there's a lot of volatility in the price level, that can be bad for businesses and households in terms of planning, right? It makes it quite difficult. I mean, in particular for a firm, for a business, makes it quite difficult to plan, say, when you're going to do some investment spending. For a household to know when to save and maybe when to spend. So if price level is constantly changing, planning becomes really difficult. And then we have this term menu costs, which is like particularly relevant for businesses, which is if the general price level is changing, if the price of your inputs is changing quite a lot, and therefore you need to change the price of your final product. If you have to do that quite a lot, and particularly if you producing a catalog or like an actual sort of hard copy of your prices, then that's going to be quite costly, having to kind of constantly update, change the prices. Now, why is it called menu cost? Because this is, say, particularly relevant for a restaurant, where they have a menu with fixed prices on it that need to be potentially changed. So issues with volatility. And then the final thing is to consider is deflation. So if there's a falling price level, there's one particular worrying consequence of that, which is if consumers and potentially businesses as well, if they see prices falling, if they see deflation, they might think, well, if this carries on, then maybe I've got this kind of big thing I'm thinking about buying. For a consumer, for a household, that could be like a car or some like big item of furniture. If you see prices falling, you might think, well, maybe I'm better off waiting. Right? I'm better off kind of holding on. Let me kind of wait a little bit longer to see the prices carry on falling, because I want to try and buy this item when it's at its cheapest. And this can, as I've written here, delay consumption. And from a kind of a whole economy's perspective, if lots of households are delaying consumption, this could have a decrease. This could lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, and then potentially lead into a recession. So this is why deflation can be a particularly worrisome issue for policymakers. So I think that's the kind of setup. Oh no, sorry, there's one more thing, which is, so there's a little bit about why inflation and like low and stable inflation could be good. And so there's two kind of justifications for it. One is this phrase, greasing the wheels. So this idea that low stable inflation can actually be quite helpful in the labor market. So the idea there is, all the time in the labor market, we've got different types of workers, skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled workers. And every year, some workers might kind of see real wages increase, but in some cases, real wages might decrease. Now, notice I've said real wages, because it could be quite helpful within the labor market for the kind of change in real wages to get masked a little bit, because what kind of workers don't want to see is their nominal wage go down, right? Like there's a kind of psychological block there that nobody wants to see their nominal wage fall. But if there's, say, a 1% nominal wage increase, or even nominal wages stay flat, but there's inflation of, say, 2%, what that actually means is a decrease in the real wage. Now, for a lot of people, that won't bother them too much, because they won't even really notice, to be honest, like a 1%, or I'm not sure what I said, a 2% change in inflation, a 2% change in the price level. That's not something that maybe people will notice that to that great an extent. But what they will notice is if their nominal wage went down. So what this means, the combination of like nominal wages not changing or going up by a small amount, but inflation being higher, can actually mean that real wages can fall. And that can send important signals within the market that allows maybe some people to in reality lose out while others gain. And that's an important kind of mechanism for the labor market working effectively. Now, a second important aspect of why we might want low stable inflation is the room to maneuver for monetary policy. So central banks who set the kind of policy rate or the base interest rate, they will want there to be some inflation, so that will allow them to actually kind of move the real interest rate properly, right? If inflation is like zero, then there's a lot less room for them to actually have an impact on the economy by changing the interest rate, by changing the nominal interest rate that they are setting. So that's the second reason why low inflation can be a positive thing. It gives the central bank a bit of room for maneuver. It allows them to actually have an impact on the real interest rate. Whereas if there isn't very much inflation at all, then they can't really do that. So those are some of the reasons why inflation can be potentially a useful thing. We also saw some reasons why it can be harmful if it's too volatile. And we saw why deflation can be quite a worrying thing for policymakers. So what we're going to do now is kind of now look at how can we model where inflation comes from. But before I do that, just going to take a quick pause. Okay, so picking back up. So how we are going to imagine how inflation comes about is very much using our model of the labor market. And so just a couple of quick reminders about how that model worked, and in particular, how we imagine firms making decisions. So we imagine that firms have three different departments to them: a HR department, a marketing department, and a production department. Now, the production department is one we're not going to worry about so much in this unit, but we are going to think about the HR and marketing departments. So remember that the HR department are the ones who decide on a nominal wage, okay, based on maybe last year's. So they take they take a few things into account, but they want to pick a nominal wage, and then they take into account what was last year's price level, and knowing what nominal wage they need to choose and a price level from last year, that allows the HR department to choose a particular real wage that will get workers to put in effort. So to kind of sum that up, HR department needs to look at what's the current unemployment rate. So that way they know where they are on the wage setting curve of the workers. They need to look at last year's price level so that then when they choose their nominal wage, they're choosing a nominal wage, knowing the price level and knowing the level of unemployment that's going to get them to exactly where they want to be on the wage setting curve, which will get workers to actually put in effort. So that's all the thinking that goes into the HR department. And for the marketing department, for them, it's all about the demand for the good and the costs of the firm. So they're going to know the costs kind of based on how much the HR department has decided to pay. And remember, for the moment, we think that the only cost for the firms is labor. And so once the marketing department is aware of what is the kind of nominal wage that's being paid, then, and they're also aware of the demand curve for the product that their firm's producing, then what they can do is choose a price and as a result, a quantity that's going to maximize profits. So HR department is kind of setting a nominal wage / a real wage. Marketing department are setting a price. So just bearing that in mind. Now, how do we then bring in like how inflation comes about? Well, I'm not going to go through this bit in too much detail, but there's a few different things that could cause inflation. And you can see, one, an increase in the bargaining power of firms over their consumers, and two, an increase in the bargaining power of workers over firms. So I think the best way to understand this is to look at these three diagrams here. So with the first one, this is about, okay, owners' power rises relative to consumers. So one thing to find about here is that the real wage can be, and remember the real wage is the nominal wage, is a capital W and a small w, over the price level. That can be linked to lambda, the productivity of labor, the average product of labor, times 1 minus mu, the markup, right? And we know that the markup is linked to the level of competition that the firms face. So lower competition means that firms can get away with charging a higher markup, right? That they can increase prices so that they are increasing their profits. So let's consider what's that gonna mean here? Well, if mu gets bigger, the markup's getting bigger, then this term 1 minus mu is actually getting smaller, which means the real wage must be getting smaller. And we're kind of assuming that the nominal wage is not changing here. So how is the real wage getting smaller if the nominal wage is constant? Well, it must be that the general price level is going up, which means that firms must be increasing their prices. And what do we see that means over here in our labor market diagram? Well, if W, the nominal wage, stays the same and the price level goes up, the real wage is falling, and that means the price setting curve is falling. And what do we see here? That now there is a gap between, so at a particular level of employment, there is a gap between the real wage that firms are willing to pay and the real wage that workers are expecting to get. And what we'll see later is how that could then drive inflation. And I mean, you've kind of seen it to an extent. Price level's gone up, which means inflation. I think what we'll see later on is how this could lead to kind of rising inflation. But that right there gives us higher prices, gives us inflation. So option number 2, employees' power rises relative to owners, and maybe because of stronger unions. So if employees have stronger bargaining power, what are we going to see happen? Well, now, no matter what the level of unemployment is, at every level of unemployment, workers are going to demand higher wages. And so that means the entire wage setting curve is shifting upwards, right? You can see it shifts up from the bold purple line to this dashed one. And again, that means at a given level of employment, which is what the x-axis here shows, a given level of employment, now there again is a bit of a gap between here, the wage that firms are willing to pay, and here, the wage that workers want. And so what we'll see in more detail later on is if workers are demanding higher wages, that means firms are going to have to respond by increasing wages. But then what will the firms do after they've increased wages? They'll also have to then increase their price to maintain the same markup that they had before. So increased wages leads to increased prices. So again, how we get inflation. And our third example is actually not a sort of fundamental change. You can see these first two, there's like a fundamental change to what's going on in either the goods market or the labor market. Here, lower level of competition, here, stronger unions. This third example is actually a less fundamental change. It's just we are in a business cycle upswing. So what does that mean? It means that aggregate demand has increased. And as a result of aggregate demand increasing, the level of employment has gone up in order to produce this extra output. And so now we're at a higher level of employment where you can see nothing's actually changed about the price setting curve or the wage setting curve, but we're just at a level of employment where, again, there's a gap between the real wage that firms are willing to pay and the real wage that workers are going to demand. And then similar to example number 2, this is going to mean that firms are going to have to pay higher wages. And as a result, they'll then increase their prices, and increasing prices means inflation. So we're going to dive into these examples, I think all of them, in a lot more detail and kind of see the full story later on. But this is a nice starting point to show us some of the causes, some of the things that can kind of lead to inflation. Okay, so next thing to talk about is, well, why do we have well, I suppose like some of the story behind why we get inflation. And it's largely down to, you can see I've written it up here, conflict over the pie, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, the pie is essentially the money available to firms. And how much money is available to firms? Well, a good way of thinking about it is to think about labor productivity. So labor productivity, and I'll put the letter we normally use, lambda, that represents the output per worker, right, in a given amount of time. And here's a very important point. What we're actually thinking about is the value of the output per worker in a given amount of time. So this lambda actually represents an amount of money. And when we're in equilibrium in the labor market, where you can see here, we're at point A, then the value of that output is getting split between the workers. And you can see this double-headed arrow here, that represents the real wage level, right? So that is the amount, the kind of proportion of the output, of the value of the output that goes to workers, that's their wage. Now the rest, this bit up here, that represents the value of the output that goes to the firms. right? This is the real profit per worker. And when we're in equilibrium, they're both happy, right? There's no conflict over the pie. We've got profits going to the firms, wages going to the workers, and everybody's happy. So the problem comes in if we shift away from this equilibrium. So let's imagine a shift to the left first, right? A shift to the left where employment is falling. And that means we're moving along our wage setting curve where the real wage that workers would require in order to put in effort is now actually lower. And at the moment, right, the price setting curve hasn't kind of shifted or anything like that. So we've still got this same level of profit being made by the firms. But what they're going to realize is they potentially could increase their profit, right? There is a gap here, which we'll now refer to by the name used in the textbook, a bargaining gap. And this is in fact a negative bargaining gap, because we kind of think of the bargaining gap from the perspective of the workers. And from the workers' perspective, they're actually now in a bad position at this higher level of unemployment. And so the firms might look at this and think, well, hold on a second, we now potentially could lower wages. And in a moment, we'll see, well, what will be the knock-on effect of the firms doing that? But let's now also consider what happens if employment goes up. Well, if employment goes up, now the workers are feeling kind of safer. They're feeling like they've got more bargaining power. And so at this higher level of employment, workers are now going to demand a higher real wage. But hold on, we've got a problem, because that's going to mean that now the firms can't get that level of profit that they were getting before. And so we have a bit of a conflict. And this time, this double-headed arrow I'm drawing in here, again, it's a bargaining gap, a gap between the real wages that workers are demanding and the real wages that firms are willing to pay. But this time it's positive because now the workers are the ones who are feeling like they have extra power. So what's going to be the consequence of these bargaining gaps? Well, we've got a nice little flow chart which shows us what will happen. So if there's a bargaining gap, all right, then that's going to lead to firms are going to have to respond to that by, and here's where I want to be careful, by increasing wages in the case of a positive bargaining gap. But actually here, when we had a negative bargaining gap, actually firms would respond by decreasing wages. But that means that firms will either, if they have a positive bargaining gap, have to increase, there'll be an increase in their unit costs, right? The cost of labor has gone up. Or if there's a negative bargaining gap, decrease in wages, that means a decrease in unit costs. And here's a really big important assumption we make here. We assume that the level of competition that the firms are facing hasn't changed. So when costs go up or go down, then the firm can respond to that. In order to maintain that same markup, they can increase prices or decrease prices. So we see a positive bargaining gap leads to higher wages, which leads to higher costs for the firm, higher unit costs, and that will lead the firm to increase their prices and we get inflation. Whereas if there's a negative bargaining gap, firms can get away with decreasing wages, that lowers their costs, and that means they can pass that on and decrease prices, and we would get deflation. And that is sort of the fundamental kind of story that we tell about how inflation or deflation can come about. And that's like the key process to have in mind. And we're going to see that come back a lot more throughout the rest of this video. Okay. So the next thing to bring in is what's called the Phillips curve. And I'll do that in 1 second after just taking a short little pause. Okay, so just picking back up, what we're now going to do is bring into this story this thing called the Phillips curve. So in the middle diagram here, you see the Phillips curve. And what it shows us is there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And well, why is that the case? Well, it kind of follows quite naturally from the previous explanation. So if we're at a labor market equilibrium, right? So coming all the way to the bottom here, we're in an equilibrium when unemployment's at 6%. And in terms of our aggregate demand model, this is where we are, we're at point A. And translating that up to the top diagram, labor market equilibrium, where the wage setting curve and the price setting curve are intersecting. And we've got a kind of real wage that is good for both the workers and the firms. But if something happened that, say, pushed unemployment to a lower level, right? So there's been, for some reason, an increase in aggregate demand, something has spurred some extra investment or autonomous consumption's changed, and that pushes us up to a new goods market equilibrium at point B, where now there's this lower level of unemployment. And this is, remember, this would be a short run equilibrium. And if we go up to our top diagram, what will that do? Well, if employment gets pushed higher, we can see that's going to create a bargaining gap, right? Because now at this higher level of unemployment, the wages demanded by workers are higher than the wages that firms are willing to pay. And we can see here in this example, that gives us a 1% bargaining gap. But what did we see in our example before? That when there is a bargaining gap, well, what do firms have to do? They're then going to have to increase nominal wages, right? They're going to have to increase the wages that they offer. And that's going to mean that they're then going to see higher unit costs of production. And that's going to mean they're going to increase prices. And increased prices means inflation. And so that's what we can see in the middle diagram. And that's what the Phillips curve is showing us, that if we go to that higher level of employment, we are now going to get some inflation. And you can see that inflation will be 1% because if the bargaining gap is 1%, wages go up by 1%, unit costs go up by 1%, prices go up by 1%, and that's what inflation of 1% means. And we could go through a similar explanation for how we get to the negative, or this part of the Phillips curve. You know, there's some sort of recession, aggregate demand has fallen, unemployment's now at 9%. So in our labor market, that means the real wages workers would demand are lower than the real wages that firms are offering. So we get a negative bargaining gap. And as a result of the negative bargaining gap, what do firms do? Firms decrease wages, unit costs have gone down, prices can then fall, and falling prices means deflation. And you can see that's how we get these different points on the Phillips curve. And if we consider, you know, what would happen at all the different levels of employment and unemployment to inflation, we could then trace out the Phillips curve. So this is kind of a useful model that we'll kind of come back to again later in the video. That Phillips curve shows us this trade-off between inflation and employment or unemployment levels. Now, what we're going to think about next is how a policymaker might have kind of preferences over different inflation rates and different employment levels. So first, let's kind of start with this diagram on the right. And let's just look at, like, what is it trying to show us? So we've got employment increasing to the right. We've got inflation kind of positive here, and then down here, deflation. And then we've got this very important line here, labor supply. So there is a maximum number of workers. And what we can see is this here, this point here, F is labeled as the best outcome. Because what we're imagining is, from a policymaker's perspective, what do they want? They want the level of employment to be equal to the labor supply. Everybody's employed. Also, we can see that the best outcome is inflation of 2%. So we can see here that what the policymaker is targeting is full employment, but also 2% inflation. And then what do the indifference curves here show us? Well, what indifference curves always show us, which is constant levels of utility. So let's take this indifference curve as an example. So if we're here, where we're at the target inflation rate, right? Well, what do we see if we move along up this way? We see that the policymaker would be different between being at 2% inflation and this level of employment, okay? And they'd be different between being there and moving up here, where inflation is above the target, but employment is a bit higher. And similarly, if we go down, they would be indifferent, moving to a position where inflation is lower than the target, but again, employment is higher. And so what these indifference curves are showing us is the policymaker is willing to make some trade-offs, right? Willing to trade off a bit of inflation above the target for higher employment, and also inflation below the target for higher employment. What we can certainly see is as we move to the right towards this best outcome, that's like higher level of utility for the policymaker, right? That this indifference curve indicates a higher level of utility than this one, and this one an even higher level. And as we move towards F, that's higher and higher levels of utility. Now, the thing is, in reality, the policymaker will, as always, have a sort of feasible frontier. And in this case, it's the Phillips curve which represents that feasible frontier, right? The Phillips curve shows us what are the actual levels of inflation and employment that can be achieved given a particular set of goods market circumstances and labor market circumstances. And unsurprisingly, what do we find about what the policymaker should do? Well, the policymaker should choose to be at a point along the feasible frontier, which is a tangent to their highest possible indifference curve. And that's what we see at point C here, right? That the Phillips curve is a tangent just touching, although the diagram doesn't do this perfectly, but is just touching this indifference curve at point C. And so that the policymaker would choose or aim for this level of inflation and this level of unemployment, because that would get them to their highest possible indifference curve, given this particular Phillips curve that they're on. So that's just a way of using indifference curves and feasible sets to kind of imagine what a policymaker, maybe what a central bank governor wants to actually achieve. So what we are now going to move on to is how it's possible for the Phillips curve to actually, well, I want to say first to shift to a new Phillips curve, because shifting to a new Phillips curve is important in explaining how we can get from, say, having some inflation to that inflation then rising and getting into what's called a wage price spiral. But before I move on to that, again, I'm just going to take a pause. Okay, so how do we explain why the Phillips curve can shift and how we can get to a kind of new Phillips curve? Well, a key part of this is the idea of expectations. That we imagine that households, firms, the owners of firms, that it's not only kind of what's going on right now that's important to them, but what they expect to happen in the future that will be important. And why is that? Because we imagine that people are forward-looking, right? They are not just thinking about the here and now, they think about the future. And secondly, people see prices as a message about what might be happening right now, but also what might happen in the future. And so that's why we say that people's expectations of inflation, what they expect inflation to be, are going to have an important impact on their behavior. And so that's going to be an important way of kind of justifying how we can get to a higher Phillips curve, where now people's expectations of inflation have changed. So to kind of build towards that, we're going to go back to this idea of looking at like a bargaining gap and how it can lead to inflation, and then see how it can actually lead to rising inflation. So, okay, let's again start at equilibrium down here so the equilibrium here, and this is actually a very, very important kind of like jump we're now going to make, which is if we look at this curve that we're on now, we see that at equilibrium, and we're just being told that that's 6% unemployment level, and that's where we're gonna have equilibrium in the labor market. But at that equilibrium, the inflation rate would actually be 3%. Okay, so this is really important, a really important jump. We're now saying at equilibrium in the labor market, people would expect to see 3% inflation. Okay, so then going up labor market, if we're in equilibrium, then price setting curve, wage setting curve are meeting, and everybody's happy. There's no conflict over the size of the pie. So now we imagine a bit of a shock. Something has changed. And here, the shock is some demand shock, some positive demand shock, which is pushing unemployment down to 3%. So what's that going to mean up here in our labor market diagram? Well, at a higher level of employment, we now see this bargaining gap open up, right? And here, we're imagining that gap is 2%. There's a 2% difference between the real wages that workers are demanding to put in effort and the real wages that firms are currently offering. So now we need to think through like the full story of what's going to happen. And a kind of a crucial part of this narrative around inflation is we assume that firms are only able to change wages and prices once a year. Right? So this positive shock, demand shock, has happened at some point, and then there's like a bit of a delay, and then we get to the point in the year where firms are bargaining with workers over wages, and then straight after that, they then set their prices for the following year. So let's think, what are the workers kind of demanding in this bargain? Well, if things had stayed at 6% unemployment, they would have expected a 3% inflation rate, right? So workers would be expecting prices to rise by 3%. So they would naturally say to the firms, well, in order to maintain our wage where it is, our real wage where it is, you're going to have to give us a 3% increase in nominal wages. So that would be what would have happened without this positive demand shock. Now that there has been a positive demand shock and this 2% bargaining gap opens up, now the workers are going to go into this meeting and think, well, hold on, we're in an even stronger position now that unemployment's really low. So now we're not going to demand just a 3% increase in our nominal wage. We're actually going to add on top of that this 2% extra because we're in this stronger position. So what will workers do? They will demand an increase in their nominal wages of 5%. From the firm's perspective, and this is the HR department of the firm, because they deal with the bargaining, they are going to think, well, if we don't agree to this 5% nominal wage increase, then we can see workers will not put in effort, right? If we keep real wages sort of where they are, we don't kind of give this increase in nominal wages of the full 5%, workers aren't going to put in effort, and that's really bad for us. So we have to, HR department is going to offer the 5% nominal wage increase. But now we go to the marketing department of the firm, the ones who set the price. And from their perspective, what have they just seen happen? They have seen nominal wages go up by 5%. Therefore, unit costs have gone up by 5%. And now here's a big assumption. Big assumption is that we are imagining the level of competition they face in the goods market hasn't changed. And so they can maintain the same markup that they had before. And so when they see costs go up by 5%, what do? They just increase prices by 5%. And that's going to now mean prices have gone up by 5%. We now have inflation of 5%. So we can see using this model how we can get this higher level of inflation. But now the next really key thing is, what is that going to mean kind of going forward? What is that going to mean for next year? Well, here's a really key flow chart. And the first part of it is really the important thing. We imagine that because people are forward looking, they are going to change their expectations of inflation. And their new expectation of inflation is going to be equal to whatever inflation was last year. And that then is going to have a real knock-on effect to what's going to happen in the following year. I think this diagram below is going to illustrate this to us. So this is just showing us kind of precisely the same thing as before, which is that, we've had this positive demand shock, which has pushed unemployment lower. It's opened up this bargaining gap. And we saw firms are going to have to respond by offering a nominal wage increase of not only the expected inflation of 3%, but also an extra 2% to satisfy this like positive bargaining gap. And as a result, their costs have gone up by that same 5%, and therefore they're going to increase prices by 5%. And so what will people actually see in the economy over the course of, say, the next year? They're going to see a 5% increase in the price level. And what we imagine is therefore their expectations of inflation for the following year will have changed. And this is the really crucial part. We now imagine if expectations have changed, if unemployment was at 6% at that equilibrium level, that expectations of unemployment, or sorry, not unemployment, expectations of inflation would be at 5%. Expectations have now shifted from people expecting 3% inflation at the labor market equilibrium to now expecting 5% inflation at the labor market equilibrium. And this is the key shift, right? This has shifted us now to a higher Phillips curve, because now at the equilibrium, people are expecting higher inflation. And if we go to higher employment or lower employment, we now have a completely different Phillips curve, which is telling us what inflation will be. But we're not done there, because if we think about the workers' perspective, what have they seen happen after the bargaining? Well, initially they're happy because their nominal wages went up by 5%. But then when they actually go out and kind of spend their money over the next year, they're going to realize prices have also gone up by 5%. So our real wages haven't actually increased at all. So we're kind of back where we started. And what does that mean in terms of the bargaining gap? It means it's still there. There's still a 2% bargaining gap. So when we get to the next round of negotiations, what are the workers going to demand? What are the firms going to do? Well, now the expectations of inflation, that's what this over here is showing us, the expectations of inflation are now at 5%, right? If unemployment had been at 6%, workers would have expected prices to go up by 5%, and so would have demanded a nominal wage increase of 5%. But this bargaining gap still exists. And so what are workers going to demand? They're going to demand an increase equal to their expected inflation and the bargaining gap, which is 5% plus 2%. So they're going to expect a nominal wage increase of 7%. What do firms do? Well, they do what they have to keep workers putting in effort. They give them the nominal wage increase of 7%. But then we go to the second part of the firm, the marketing department. They've seen now a 7% increase in their nominal wages, in their unit costs. And if we again assume there's no change in competition, to maintain that markup that they can, they will now increase their prices by 7%. So what's the inflation that everyone sees in the following year? It's 7%. And this could carry on, right? Because again, what are workers going to see over the course of the following year? 7% increase in nominal wages, but also a 7% increase in the price level. So what's happened to their real wages? Again, they've stayed stagnant. That bargaining gap hasn't been closed, hasn't been fulfilled. And while that is still the case, while there's still a positive bargaining gap, this cycle can carry on and on and on. And there's a useful diagram that kind of shows us what could happen. So this one here, so year one, there is no bargaining gap, and inflation and expected inflation are the same. They're that 3%. But if a bargaining gap suddenly opens up because of, say, some boost to aggregate demand, now the expected inflation for that year is still 3% because expectations haven't changed. But because workers are now seeing this bargaining gap, their demand for an increase in nominal wages will equal expected inflation plus the size of the bargaining gap. So it'll be 5%. And as we saw, firms will pass on the extra cost in terms of higher prices of 5%. And so now inflation in that year will be 5%. But now expectations of inflation change. They now push up to 5%. And the bargaining gap hasn't closed, right? You can still see, still got this 2% bargaining gap. And what's that going to mean? Well, the following year, there has to be a 7% increase in nominal wages, and therefore a 7% increase in costs, and therefore a 7% increase in prices. And so the actual inflation people will see will be 7%. And so year three, we see expectations of inflation have pushed up to 7%. And this is just going to carry on and on and on, unless something happens which brings this bargaining gap back down to zero. So how could that happen? Well, it could be that the initial kind of aggregate demand boost sort of just disappears for some reason, or the government or the central bank could step in to try and close that bargaining gap. And that idea of the government stepping in is something we're going to talk about more in later parts of the video. Okay, so, right. So what I'm going to do before we talk about the policy is look at the difference between demand shocks, which we've mostly focused on so far, and a supply shock, which can lead to a sort of a bit of a different outcome. But before I go into that, again, I'm just going to take a quick pause. So most of what we looked at so far have been demand shocks, right? Things that led to a higher level of employment or potentially a lower level of employment, and that led us to have a shift sort of along the wage setting curve. But it's also possible for inflation to come from a supply shock. And like the kind of biggest examples of this in the past 50 years were in the 1970s, where we had these big increases in the price of oil, one in like 1973 and 74, one in 1979. And we can use this model of like the Phillips curve and the labor market to imagine how this could have happened. And also importantly, to see how a supply shock could actually lead to both inflation and also higher levels of unemployment. So first, the really important thing is let's imagine where are we beginning with? So we're beginning with this pre-oil shock labor market equilibrium. So we're here where the original price setting curve intersects with the wage setting curve here at point A. And then we imagine there's been some shock, there's been some increase in the oil price. So let's think through what's that going to do? Well, oil is a very, very important input into lots and lots of firms' production process. And if the price of one of their inputs goes up, then the costs of production are obviously going up. And what firms will do is pass on that increase in their costs into an increase in prices. Again, assuming that the markup that they can charge hasn't changed, assuming that nothing's changed about the level of competition in the goods market, firms will pass on that increased cost of oil, that increased cost of production in terms of higher prices. And remembering that this price setting curve, so I'll write the equation down again, little w, the real wage equals nominal wage over the price level. And we saw that that's linked to productivity and 1 minus mu. So what's kind of going on here is firms are increasing the price level, they're increasing P, and that's going to bring the real wage that they're paying down. And that's why we see the price setting curve shift down as a result of this oil shock. So in this case, now, if initially we try to maintain the same level of employment, then we can see we're going to get this bargaining gap, right? This positive bargaining gap. And as a result, what's going to happen? Well, the same process as we saw before, and potentially a wage price spiral. This positive bargaining gap leads workers in the next round of negotiations to demand a higher nominal wage. And the firms, knowing that they need to get workers to put in effort, will offer that higher nominal wage. And that will then lead to higher costs of production for the firms, which leads them to increase their prices further. But now, from the workers' perspective, the increase in their nominal wage has just been matched by the same increase in the price level. So the real wage hasn't actually changed at all. So there's still a bargaining gap in place. And then the next round of negotiations, they're going to still ask for another 2% increase. And this can carry on and on and on. And so we get that process again of inflation and potentially rising inflation. And then how do we get the higher levels of unemployment? Well, if eventually we do get to the new longer term equilibrium, the post-oil shock equilibrium, you can see that's going to be here at point B, where the level of employment is lower, but there's a higher level of unemployment. So while there's an attempt to maintain the same level of employment, that's going to push up inflation, and we're going to move to new higher and higher and higher Phillips curves. And then eventually, when we do allow things to move to the new labor market equilibrium, we'll get a higher level of unemployment. And so rising inflation and higher unemployment. And that's what we term stagflation. And that's a bit of a difference, right? We saw with the demand shocks, we get inflation, but we'd also get maybe higher levels of employment. Whereas a supply shock, you can see we get rising inflation and actually eventually higher unemployment. So supply shocks, much kind of worse impact. Okay, so I think what we move on to now is looking at how policy could be used to try and have an impact, to an extent, on the rate of inflation, but also we're going to see how actually it can have an impact on kind of aggregate demand, and then how that might then kind of have an impact on inflation. And the first thing is this idea of monetary policy. So a central bank, they sort of have, they have quite a few tools at their disposal. The main tool that they have is setting what's called the policy interest rate. So this like base interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow from them. And typically that will also be the rate that commercial banks borrow from each other at. And so the setting of that policy interest rate, you can see what this diagram is showing us, will have an impact on market interest rates. It will also have an impact on asset prices, and then just people's and firms' general levels of expectations and confidence about the economy. And later on, we'll see how it can have an impact on the exchange rate. And all of these things then tie into what's going to be the level of net exports that we see, what's the level of aggregate demand in the domestic economy, and that together gives us the level of aggregate demand. And the level of aggregate demand is going to determine what level of inflationary pressure we have in the domestic economy. And then we see the exchange rate is going to have an impact on import prices. And these things taken together can then have an impact on inflation. So changes in the policy interest rate can feed through in all these different ways to the level of import prices and the level of aggregate demand. And these things together are going to determine the prices that consumers face and how those prices are going to change, and so can feed through to inflation. So this is sort of why the central bank using policy interest rate can have an impact on inflation. But limitations. So two really important limitations to how useful monetary policy is. The first is short-term nominal interest rate can't go below zero. So the nominal interest rate that a bank sets, they typically would never ever want to put the nominal interest rate below zero, because what that would mean is if that gets then passed on in terms of commercial banks, and commercial banks say had like a zero nominal interest rate, what that would mean is if you went to the bank and put your money in, that you'd have to pay the bank to hold on to money. And in that case, people might decide, well, actually, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to hold on to it myself. And then the banking system as a whole could then get into serious problems because commercial banks have no kind of base money from depositors. And so that's why this is a bit of a limitation. The central bank doesn't want to put nominal interest rates below zero, because then they'll get into those kind of problems. And the second thing, which some countries face, is that some countries don't have their own currency. Like there are a lot of countries in the world which use the US dollar, or think about like the Eurozone. And as a result, they don't have their own independent monetary policy because they can't kind of influence the supply of money. They can't kind of change the interest rate because it's the country whose currency they're using who's influencing the interest rate. So that's another thing to bear in mind. All right. So one other option that central banks have to try and influence things, aside from interest rates, is something called quantitative easing. And just to kind of briefly go through how this works, well, what the central bank can do is create base money, right? So it has the ability to do this. It can create some base money, and it uses this base money to actually buy bonds, commercial bonds, corporate bonds, or government bonds, and some other financial assets. And what that's going to do is increase the demand for those bonds and assets. And that increased demand for those bonds and assets will push up their prices, okay, make them kind of more expensive. And as a result, you can see that will decrease the yield and decrease the interest rate on those bonds, right? Makes them less appealing, right? Now that they're more expensive, the amount that you could make from investing in them is less, right? Your return from them is going to be lower because they're now more expensive to buy. And as a result, the central bank is hoping that that means maybe households, firms, investors, they will not be as willing to buy these bonds and financial assets, and instead they'll go out and spend. So from firms, maybe firms will increase their investment. Households, maybe they'll just go out and increase their consumption. And as a result, that quantitative easing policy could potentially, as it says here, boost aggregate demand, right? And this can be a useful tool, it says, because even if interest rates, nominal interest rates are close to zero, so there's like little scope for actually changing them, the quantitative easing could be the thing that could be used to boost aggregate demand. Now, I said I was going to talk about this exchange rate channel. So why does changing interest rates have an impact on exchange rates, and why this could actually feed into say monetary policy and using monetary policy to have an impact on aggregate demand? Well, we take this Australian example, this kind of slowdown in the Australian economy, as an example of how this can work. So imagine, to begin with, there's been some fall in investment, and we know investment is one of the components of aggregate demand. So that means a fall in aggregate demand. And as we've seen in our labor market model and our Phillips Curve model, that a fall in aggregate demand pushing us to higher levels of unemployment, that can move us along the Phillips curve to where there is less inflation or potentially deflation. Now, in this case, less inflation. And as a result of seeing that, what does Australia's central bank do? Well, they cut interest rates, right? So this is the kind of key bit on maybe the exchange rate. So a cut in interest rates by the Australian central bank would actually mean that the demand for Australian bonds, Australian maybe government bonds, is going to fall, right? Because the interest you can earn on those bonds is now lower. And as a result of a lower level of demand for Australian bonds, the demand for the Australian currency is going to fall as well. And if there's a fall in demand for the Australian currency, that means the exchange rate is going to get weaker. Now, this actually could all end up, I mean, at the moment, this sounds kind of bad, right? But actually, this could end up helping the situation, because if the Australian currency is weaker, you can see what's that going to mean about exports and imports? Well, it means now that exports have become cheaper relative to maybe exports from other countries, because if you need to spend less of your currency to get hold of the Australian currency to then buy Australian goods, then those Australian goods have become cheaper. Similarly, imports into Australia, Australians using their own currency to then get hold of foreign goods, now they have to use more of their currency to get the foreign currency to buy those goods from abroad. That's going to make imports now more expensive. So if exports are cheaper and imports are more expensive, we might expect to see an increase in the level of exports, a decrease in the level of imports, and then overall an increase in net exports, which is another component of our aggregate demand equation. And if there's an increase in that, there'll be an increase in aggregate demand. And so this is sort of the channel through which we saw initially a change in interest rates can then feed through into a change in exchange rates, which can have an impact on aggregate demand. So that's another channel we can take into account when we think about how monetary policy might kind of fix a problem or try and help change or try and kind of get us back to a higher level of aggregate demand. All right, so I think I'm going to go on to this in a second, but just before I do, I'm going to take a pause. Okay, so just a few small things to finish off this video with. So one is, I guess, an example of kind of the whole picture of now our multiplier model and our Phillips curve and our labor market model all being put together. So the top diagram here brings us back to our sort of policymakers' preferences for inflation and employment. And we see the Phillips curve is our feasible frontier, right? It tells us the combinations of inflation and employment that are possible. And then we've got our blue indifference curves showing us kind of combinations of employment and inflation that give the policymaker constant levels of utility. And as we saw before, point C is where the policymaker would choose to be, right? The place along the indifference curve that gets them to their highest, the place along the Phillips curve, along the feasible frontier, that gets them to the highest possible indifference curve. And that's going to be where it's a tangent to an indifference curve. So that's that point C right there. And we see down here that that kind of coincides with where aggregate demand before this downturn crosses our 45-degree line. So that's our goods market equilibrium. So what we imagine now is, well, what happens if there's some slump, right? Again, so we've got an investment slump, and we know that a reduction in investment causes a parallel shift downwards of aggregate demand. And that would move us to point D here as our new goods market equilibrium, which is a lower level of output, a lower level of income, and a lower level of employment. So that's going to mean, in terms of this Phillips curve, a shift along to this point here, where now higher level of unemployment and also some lower inflation. Now, this is away from where the policymaker wants to be, right? You can see we're getting further and further away from this best outcome. So this is where government can step in, and we imagine them stepping in two ways. And you can see it says monetary and fiscal stimulus. So let's imagine that the central bank decides to cut the interest rate, maybe increase like the amount of quantitative easing, and then some fiscal stimulus. So maybe there's been some increase in government spending or a cut to tax rates, and that hopefully will push aggregate demand back up to its original level, back up to this goods market equilibrium at C, and then that's going to mean back up to higher levels of output, higher levels of employment, and that moves us back along our Phillips curve to this point C again, which is where the policymaker wants to be. Now, that is how government policy should work in an ideal world, but actually achieving this is obviously much more complicated. But this is how we can use our model to imagine what policymakers are trying to achieve when there is some sort of downturn. Now, two final things just to finish off with. One is just to pick out a couple of really important things that happened in the 1990s and 2000s. Because the 1970s to in the 1980s, we saw these like really high levels of inflation, high levels of unemployment, things that were kind of unexpected. People, based on what we thought about the Phillips curve, didn't expect to see these two things happening at the same time. And like what we'll see more of, I think, in Unit 17 is how governments responded to these things. But one really important part of the response was that central banks were made independent of government control, as in the responsibility for monetary policy, for say targeting inflation and changing interest rates, was put in the hands of the central bank, and the government of the day, whoever was elected, had no control over that. So that was a really important step because it took monetary policy, it took interest rate responsibility away from elected officials and gave it to an independent body. And the second thing that kind of went along with this is lots of central banks then began this policy of inflation targeting, of saying explicitly, this is a level of inflation that we are going to aim for. And these two policies were kind of instrumental, we think, in lowering the level of kind of inflation in lots of countries and keeping it low and keeping it stable and allowing for what's called this period of the Great Moderation. So just wanted to pick out, those are two really, really important developments. Now, one final thing is what we've talked about so far is how changes in kind of bargaining power between workers and firms, or between firms and their consumers, how that can lead to inflation. One other way it can happen is actually to do with what's called capacity utilization. So how much are firms using the factors of production that they have available to them? And this diagram is showing us that when this level of capacity utilization goes up, this can actually lead to the markup increasing and prices increasing, and could lead to inflation as well. So what's the story behind that? Well, we imagine when capacity utilization goes up, when firms are using more and more of their factors of production, that's probably in response to like a higher level of demand for goods. And as a result, this higher level of demand, kind of which is indicated by higher levels of capacity utilization, that probably means that there's now less competition, because if all firms have this higher level of demand, it probably means consumers can't get those goods elsewhere. And so we imagine that means the level of competition has fallen. And we know when the level of competition in the goods market falls, that firms now are able to charge a higher markup, and a higher markup will probably mean that they'll increase prices, and increased prices means inflation. So that's just another important consideration to kind of have in mind, that actually it's also the level of capacity utilization could have an influence on the inflation that we see. Okay, so that is it for Unit 15. As always, I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I'll leave it there.